Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to kick off today's selections of special selections with a request from TS. It says, I think you might enjoy Univers Zero. Try the opening track from their 81 album Sous Dieu Deux. It's called Dense. You might want to Google Rock in Opposition for additional context. So I did Google Rock in Opposition. It was a movement representing a collective of progressive bands in the late 70s united in their opposition to the music industry that refused to recognize their music. So it seems like a bunch of bands were making pretty good music, and the music industry didn't want to sign them onto labels and stuff, so they just went and put on their own shows. And Univers Zero was one of the bands in this collective. So, let's dive in and see what they're bringing to the table with the track Dense. I think we're in a 9/8. Difficult to tell with all the syncopation going on. Really cool dynamic work. Volume, width, placement, harmonic. There's just a lot of elements that are swapping around, creating a very diverse soundscape. It's really interesting how it has the sonic playfulness of retro prog rock, but a lot of the mathy elements of modern prog metal. It almost feels like a really unique middle point. Feels a little even klezmer right here. This is in 4/4. We're alternating 7/8 and 9/8. And 7 and 9 is 16. Oh man. Just one bar is a little shorter than expected and next is a little longer. Dang, what is that? And it was a tuba, but I think it was paired with a woodwind, which would have been an oboe? Maybe, I think an oboe would have been too high. Could have been one of those fancy bass saxophones that I've discovered recently, which are very cool. And even while going for something a bit more introspective here and atmospheric, they still have a Mathy thing going on in the backgrounds. Kind of going for a bit of a trance thing here. There is a melody on top, but for the most part, it's just very static, psychedelic stuff. Ooh. Just kind of dissipated all that energy. So we're in doom tempo area, funeral doom tempo area. Working in 3/4 from what I can tell. We're in a really weird key too. It feels chromatic at times, but it's sort of like a fleeting chromaticism. I knew it. Oh man. What are y'all having me listen to? The song is sort of split up into two ideas here. One being the more mathy, chaotic stuff that we heard at the beginning of the track, and the atmospheric stuff that took up the last 4 to 5 minutes. The mathy stuff is bonkers all over the place. There's metric ideas happening everywhere. There's counterpoint, there's counter rhythm, there's probably counter polyrhythm, and possibly polymeter going on in this track as well. It is all over the place, not to mention the time signatures are kind of bonkers. I counted out at the beginning, I thought I felt a 9/8, but it was 9/8 in a single bar, and I didn't further investigate what was going on given just how much stuff was happening at the time. So I just kind of left it be. I spent enough time trying to figure out that 9/8 as it was, and I had other music I needed to listen to, so I backed away from it. But later I returned to another part that felt similar, was also 9/8 half the time. The other half was 7/8. 9 plus 7 is 16, which gives us a good old 4/4. It's just that one of the 4/4s is a bit shorter than you'd expect, and the other 4/4 is just a hair bit longer than you'd expect, and so it feels like the song is squashing and stretching. It's getting longer and it's getting shorter. It's getting longer, it's getting shorter. You're stumbling over things because you're not expecting a change already, and then you stumble again because you were expecting a change and it wasn't there this time. And all of it comes down to this shifting meter idea that when it all ends up, it's 4/4, but they play around with where ideas and phrases begin and end in much a way like Meshuggah does today, playing in 4/4, but you'd never guess it listening to their music. That's sort of what we're seeing here in these sections. On top of that, though, there are all sorts of instruments playing in all sorts of rhythms. I'm also not entirely sure that the phrasing is consistent across all of our ideas, so there might be some polymetric concepts going on as well. But we have instruments doing tuplets, we have instruments doing quarter notes, we have instruments playing around syncopated rhythmic phrases. It is very difficult to get a grasp on any of the rhythmic elements in the first half of this track because of all of these various rhythmic components being done simultaneously. It's why when I hit the 9/8 and I was like, oh, this is 9/8, but it's difficult to get a read on. And that's, I think I said that there in the reaction. It just, there's so many things going on. You don't know what rhythm to listen to get that pulse. So it's incredibly dense rhythmically. But we find a different kind of well, there's also a second kind of density going on here that we explore more further into the track as well. This being width and layers and volume, even at times. There are so many instruments, so many different parts, all playing simultaneously. Very rarely is there anything happening in direct harmony where they're playing the same ideas, just at different pitches. Most instruments throughout the first half of this track are all doing their own thing, and there's a lot of instruments going on here. We have brass, we have strings, we have drums, we have pianos. There's some extended auxiliary percussion going on in here. I think I heard timpanis at one point in time. I can't imagine lugging all of this around to do shows, but I'm going to assume they did. Just wild. I think I also heard some guitar in there. There's a bass of some sort. There's woodwinds for sure. There's just a lot of. This is basically a prog rock band if they had a full orchestra on hand. Kind of minus the rock elements. There is a guitar at times, and there is a bass instrument that feels finger picked. Yeah, it isn't bowed, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's an electric guitar. There's no vocalist here. There is a drum kit though. That's, I think, is almost the rockiest part of the entire outfit. Um, but yeah, there's just a lot of a lot going on at any one time. And not even just that. I mean, we can look at volume dynamics too. Instruments being at different volume levels, notes within an instrument phrase being at different volume levels, the inflection of specific notes. Like there's a lot of different ways that the instruments are playing the notes that they're playing. But then there's also another layering, which is harmonic, in that a lot of this song doesn't feel like it's in a key. It feels like instruments are in a specific key, but that the song itself is not, and it introduces a ton of dissonance in this track. It's not the apparent kind of grating kind of dissonance that we tend to have, especially with more heavier extreme metals, but it is a soft dissonance that creates a warble sound throughout most of the song. It is quite intentional, but I hate bringing this up anytime that we get something a bit more avant-garde, but I mean, I have hours and hours and hours and hours of hearing this sound. This is the environment that I would hear this in. It's an orchestra warming up. That's what some of this feels like to me. Now, granted, I will say that there are some composed sections in here that feel more song-like than most of the avant-garde stuff we've checked out in the past. There's some stuff here that certainly feels like a song, and it does make up more of the song, more of the track than some of the other avant-garde stuff we've checked out. But there are some sections in here where it just feels like nobody is doing the same thing. Nobody's on the same page. Nobody's in their same key. They're all keeping rhythm, kind of. Again, there's all sorts of polyrhythmic things going on that everybody's out of time, but sort of still in time. It's that rhythmic density. It's impressive, I think, that so much can be going on in so many different ways with so many dynamic qualities and it still feel cohesive. There wasn't any part in the track where I kind of checked out and I was like, well, that's enough for me. That's too chaotic. I think they found a nice way to balance the more controlled style of music that's more traditional and this more chaotic avant-garde freeform stuff. And they found a nice middle point between that. Speaking of middle point, I've already talked about the rhythmic stuff here, which I mentioned earlier on that it reminds me a lot of modern prog metal. A lot of the rhythmic stuff. I've even brought up Meshuggah as a direct comparison. But this piece is exceptionally focused on, especially the first half, exceptionally focused on taking a short rhythm and extending it a little bit or chopping it up in just a little bit and varying the length of it in order to play it over and over and over and over in various lengths to tweak the phrasing length, to mess with the rhythm, the pulse of the whole song, to create the polymeter that we hear. This is a very modern idea. You can hear this all over the place in everything from Dream Theater to Animals as Leaders to Meshuggah to, I mean, it's such a popular way of creating metric heavy prog music. And to hear this came out in 81, it feels way ahead of its time. And I'm sure somebody in the comments are like, oh, I got a band who did it a year earlier. Like, yeah, I'm sure. Okay, there's always someone who did something earlier. I think this is the earliest that I have heard, though. We've checked out a lot of 70s music. We've checked out a lot of prog in the early 80s. For my experience with it, most of this metric stuff started popping up in the 90s, or at least be popping up in popular channels in the 90s, and more so into the 2000s. So I find it really interesting that we have this idea so early because it is sort of this meeting point where they're balancing this metric heavy modern sound, which it might have been modern then too. Like, oh, look at this modern prog sound. But like to me, it is modern. It's a very 2020s, 2010s kind of style of prog writing. But they merged it with the sonic experimentation of classic prog, 70s prog, in that they were playing around with harmonic ideas throughout this, weird key signatures. Even some of the instruments, I would say, I mentioned how there's a lot of different ways that people were playing their instruments. I feel like some were a bit unorthodox. I could definitely tell it was a violin, so to speak, but it was played in a way that I can't imagine how they made that sound. So sonic experimentation there as well, but also just kind of envisioning what a jazz fusion band would sound like if you had access to orchestra instruments rather than big band and rock bands. Because at the end of the day, if you gave this to a band like Coliseum, I think that's the band name, Coliseum 2? Maybe that's the song title. Or any other jazz fusion band. I don't know why they were the first one that popped up in my head. I think they could play this note for note and it really wouldn't sound that different. But at the end of the day, you'd be like, yeah, that is jazz fusion. This is straight up some of that jazz influenced prog rock stuff. But it's just not done on rock instruments. And while there are big band instruments here, they're not performed in a way that you would expect them to. The lines that you would expect the brass to have end up on the strings, and the ones you expect the strings to have end up on the woodwinds and stuff like that. It's more of that sonic experimentation going on here. And so I find it really interesting because this sits in the midpoint then. It is, unless someone else has a better example, the dividing point between the sonic experimentation of old and the metric experimentation of new. And it does so in a way that I find to be, at least for the first half, rather balanced. There is density and complexity across all levels of the composition, and it's done in a way that is listenable, which is a huge undertaking, at least as far as I'm concerned. So it leads me to what I think is probably the last thing I want to bring up, the ending. We have like a 4-minute slow burn that explores more psychedelic soundscapes. It still has a rhythmic pulse underneath everything, but rhythmic complexity is not the key here. They're just still kind of throwing that djenty idea as their foundation. The main element, which you're supposed to be listening to, are the harmonies. You listen to the one instrument create, it's not really a melody, it's just a really long passage of held notes. And then you hear the harmony on it, and then the harmony on that, and then the weird key changes that come in throughout. And you begin to take in this soundscape that's ever evolving until we have so many sounds at the end, all kind of competing for space. And then it just kind of peters out. All this chaos, this cacophony is just gone. This is 100% sonic experimentation. Really playing around with keys, playing around with notes, intervals, chords. It's not about the melodies, it's not about the rhythms. This is pure soundscape building and the experimentation within that soundscape building. How can we make something dense as an atmospheric component? You know, we already explored it rhythmically and harmonically and melodically. We created a lot of moving parts all doing their own thing. This is dense like clockwork. But let's do dense like weight, density of atmosphere. And that's where the second half comes in. And they really do explore that. It becomes very filled, where the first half feels like an expert ballet presentation, right? And there's like 12 dancers all, moving around each other, and there's some close calls, but everything is controlled and everything, it's tight moved. There's like a little line that this one dancer's got to slip through two other, and they're spinning while they're at it, and like it's just perfectly timed where the dancer goes through, and it's very complex looking, but very elegant. That's the first half of this. The second half is just pure density. Instead of having a lot of little things in a smaller space, kind of trying to work around each other, we're just going to fill the space up completely. That's it. Just the sound sphere is this big, cram all that audio in there and make it a massive sound. This is very post-rock. It's very strange to me that I have brought up so many genres in this one song, but they really are achieving what a lot of genres tend to do in isolation simultaneously. They want, I mean, I don't think post-rock was around in the early 80s, but I could be wrong on that. It's just a very forward-facing band. I don't think they went out of their way and said, "Hey, we want to be at the forefront of modern metal and djent and post rock while also retaining our influences of, prog rock." They probably just made something to sound good to them, unless they were seers and they could see into the future and were specifically tapping into trends that would become. But it is fascinating to see so many elements of modern rock and metal present here. As for what any of this means, I don't know. It's just a dense journey. It's like being crushed in 5 different ways. So I'm kind of interested what everybody else thinks about it. These are my thoughts on Universe Zero's Dense. But what about you? What did this song make you feel? Did you enjoy it? Is there anything here that stood out to you? You got your own opinion or perspective on things? Let me know down in the comment section. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you to that menu right there. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, and a link to the Discord server, as well as a bunch of other stuff. Go ahead and check it out. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all 3 of those. We do have 2 more special selections today. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow. We're going to check out some brand new music. And then Saturday, we have our album review. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.